Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Praise the Lord, it's good to be back. Now, I wish to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson, Secretary of the U.S. Navy, wrote a book talking about what we know today and see in the world as the New World Order. It's simply the reestablishment of the Old World Order. And we're talking specifically about the rise of the temporal power of the Pope. That is, the Pope's status in the world as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now, we know the kingdom of heaven has a ruler. His name is Christ. He is a priest of priests, and we know also that his counterfeit, the Pope, claims to be a bishop of bishops or priest of priests. As the Pope counterfeits Christ's priestly status, he also counterfeits his kingly status, claiming to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's what we're talking about, the temporal power of the Pope. His power as a king on the earth and King of Kings of the earth. Now, R.W. Thompson takes upon himself the challenge and artfully succeeds in destroying every argument that the papacy uses to legitimize his temporal power, his kingly status. And this is probably some of the most important material in this book. This book is from cover to cover very important information that is almost unknown in Christianity today. But it is imperative that my listeners understand in order to understand what the New World Order is and how it functions and who's at the top of it, to understand the information that's in this book. I consider this book one of the most prophetic books in my library. It's not written from a religious point of view. It's written from a secular point of view. It's a legitimate point of view, and it's one that's very valuable, and I hope my listeners appreciate it. Now, we're going to back up a page for continuity purposes and begin by reading at the top of page 332 if you're following along in your own copy, page 332. And I hope, by the way, if you don't have a copy of this book, that you get a copy and that you read it, and not once but twice, and study this book and share it with friends and family. Restore to God's house today the information that really led to the Protestant Reformation. And now we'll begin our reading on page 332, the top of the page. It says, "It is the rule of law that when a party pretends to have in his possession evidence that would explain any matter of controversy in which he is involved, the fact of his withholding it should be construed unfavorably to his pretensions. Therefore, as more than 1,100 years have elapsed since the conquest of Pepin from the Lombards, and during all this time no grant from him to the Pope has ever been produced, it is not unreasonable to conclude that none such was ever made." And we're talking about the papacy's claim to be a king. To be a king, the Pope must have a kingdom. He must rule over a territory. That's the kingdom. Now, this territory that the papacy claimed kingly status over was that area of Italy that was conquered by Pepin, or rather taken from the Lombards. Now, Pepin was king of the Franks, and the Lombards were tried to conquer part of Italy, and Pepin conquered the land that was occupied by the Lombards and gave it to the Pope. Yet, as the author states here, there's no written grant of this land. It's literally was done orally, verbally, and there's no literal proof of this so-called grant of Pepin of what became known as the Papal States to the Pope. Okay? It says, therefore, as more than 1,100 years have elapsed since the conquest of Pepin from the Lombards, and during all this time no grant from him to the Pope has ever been produced, it is not unreasonable to conclude that none such was ever made. And yet it is true, doubtless, that Pepin did put the Pope in possession of the conquered territory and confer upon him, as far as he could, the authority to govern it as the head of the Roman Church, but without any attempt to convey it by deed. So there's no written proof of this transfer of rulership of this territory by Pepin to the Pope. It says, if history were entirely silent upon the subject, this much might be inferred from the nature of their relations to each other, they being such as to create upon the part of each the reciprocal obligation to do anything the other should require. Now this is key. Listen to this. It says the Pope made Pepin a king. Now remember, both the Pope at this time, both the Pope and Pepin were subjects of the emperor, of Caesar, who was stationed in Constantinople. Yet the Pope confers kingship upon Pepin, and Pepin in return confers kingship upon the Pope. Now this can be construed in no other way as treason against their common ruler, Caesar. Okay, it says the Pope made Pepin a king. And why should not Pepin aid the Pope to break his allegiance to the Eastern emperors and become a king also? So we have the fulfillment of what Paul spoke about to the early church. He that now letteth will let, or he that now restraineth will restrain until he be taken out of the way, and then that man of sin shall be revealed. Who was taken out of the way? Caesar is now stationed in Constantinople, a great distance from Rome. And in his absence, or having moved to Constantinople, we have this mutual back-scratching taking place between the Papacy and King Pepin, each making the other a king in violation of their oath of allegiance to Caesar. We have the rising of Antichrist. The Pope at this time claiming to be a priest of priests, and now acquiring his temporal power as a king with the help of Pepin, and both are committing treason against Caesar. This is treason by any standard, both the law of man, the law of nations, and the law of God. And so we have, by the most illegitimate means, the rise of the Pope to kingly status, the acquirement of his temporal power. This is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy that was fulfilled long ago in history. Do not look to the future for the Antichrist. The Antichrist is found in history, and this is what we're talking about. The Pope made Pepin a king, and why should not Pepin aid the Pope to break his allegiance to the Eastern emperors and become a king also? Whatever would justify the act of revolt in one case would equally justify it in the other. In other words, mutual treason taking place here. If the Pope had ecclesiastical authority, which he claimed, as Bishop of Bishops, sufficient to legalize the treason of Pepin against Childeric, that is the legitimate French king. Remember, Pepin is in rebellion against the legitimate king of the Franks, Childeric. The French legions had physical power enough to legalize the Pope's treason against his lawful sovereign, that is the Emperor, the Caesar. Therefore, in this spirit of mutuality and entire disregard of all legal rights, quote, the splendid donation was granted in supreme and absolute dominion, and the world beheld for the first time a Christian bishop invested with the prerogatives of a temporal prince, unquote. So there you have it. The Pope, not only a self-proclaimed priest of priests, now claims for the first time in history a Christian bishop, that is the Pope of Rome, claiming the prerogatives of a temporal prince or a temporal king. That's the fulfillment of the full prerogative of Antichrist, both a priest and a king. This is the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Now, it is insisted by many who defend the temporal prerogatives of the Pope, in other words, the kingly authority of the popes, that this donation of Pepin only restored to them jurisdiction which they had previously possessed. Even Archbishop Kenrick, in support of this assertion, has been tempted, when speaking of the act of Pepin, incautiously to say, quote, this can scarcely be considered a mere donation, since a great portion, if not all, of the territory had already belonged to the Pope, whence Stephen IV in the year 769 urged the French princes Charles and Carloman, as a matter of duty which they owed to St. Peter, to see that his property, his quote-unquote property, usurped by the Lombards, should be fully restored, unquote. Now, this is R.W. Thompson's artful destruction of the many arguments that the papacy uses to claim its priestly, or kingly rather, its princely status over the papal states, or his kingly status in the world. Now, this bishop makes a terrible blunder, a very elementary blunder, and R.W. Thompson points it out. He said, the mind of the learned archbishop must have been somewhat confused when he wrote this. He first states as a fact the ownership of territory by the popes before the donation of Pepin in the year 754, during the pontificate of Stephen III, and to establish this, cites the action and claim of Pope Stephen IV in the year 769, 15 years afterward. You know, it's kind of like it has about as much legitimacy as believing the son saying the dog ate his homework, basically. He's using arguments that a child wouldn't believe. And it says, this is neither logical nor satisfactory. But the important question at last is whether or not the statement of fact is to be relied on. It is difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile it with the historical narrative, if indeed it is not positively contradicted. Dr. Fredit manifestly does not believe it. Now, Fredit is the author of a book known as Fredit's History, and I'm trying to get a copy of that to read for myself. But he says Dr. Fredit manifestly does not believe it. On the other hand, he directly contradicts it. He insists that the donation of Pepin was, quote, a solemn grant to the See of Rome of that part of Italy which is on this account called the ecclesiastical state, or as we often refer to it as the papal states, and has ever since composed the temporal dominions of the popes, unquote. But he immediately says, quote, Before that time, they, that is the popes, had been subject in civil matters to the Roman and Greek emperors, unquote. So Frederick points out that the Pope was not a king, he was a subject. Okay? And such is undoubtedly the fact, as history abundantly attests. This is conclusive upon the subject, that the authority and jurisdiction of the Eastern emperors over Rome never absolutely ceased until Charlemagne was made emperor of the West in the year 800, nearly half a century after the alleged donation of Pepin took place. It took the popes all this time to sunder entirely the ties of their allegiance to the East, and it was only then accomplished by the strength of the French armies. The prowess of Charlemagne made their usurped jurisdiction over civil matters secure, and until then, both by the laws of the empire and the laws of nations, the popes were the subjects of the emperors and owed to them the duty of allegiance and fidelity. So we're clearly being told that this is treason against the legitimate emperor of the empire, Caesar. This kingly status rose out of treason. This kingly status of the Pope, at best, is an act of treason by every standard. And now we continue. He says, history does not inform us that there was any political quarrel or cause of quarrel between the government at Constantinople, that is Caesar, and the people of Italy or Rome. So far as their civil affairs were concerned, everything was satisfactory and harmonious. The whole existing disagreement arose out of the question of the worship of images and was therefore entirely religious. And we're talking about the time of the iconoclasts. There was a great disagreement between the Eastern Catholic Church, that centered in Constantinople, and the Western Catholic Church, that centered in Rome. So the papacy tries to use this quarrel over the veneration and worship of images that made a division between the East and the West, Western empires, as justification for the Pope's rise as a king, as his temporal power. Now, it says, upon this subject, the difference was radical and irreconcilable, and there can be no reasonable doubt that this was the primary and inciting cause of the Pope's action. He could readily foresee his own weakness as the subject of an iconoclastic emperor, and the strength he would acquire by a close allegiance with the French kings and the establishment of a strong monarchy in the West devoted to the Church, and more especially to the papacy. Hence, the only legitimate inference from this whole conduct is that he employed the influence of religion and of the Church to excite the minds of a superstitious and ignorant population against their civil government, in order to obtain from a foreign king, that is Pepin, to whom he owed no allegiance, the concession of his temporal power, that he might thereby be enabled to break off his own lawful allegiance to the empire. More proof that this is treason, high treason. And it says, every step taken by the different popes who participated in these movements justifies this belief, and the results confirm it. Rome needed only that her pope should possess temporal power to make her superior to Constantinople. And for this prize the contest was carried on with unabated zeal until the final victory was won. How could Pope Stephen III, while occupying the relation of subject to the empire, acquire title to territory or temporal power by the donation of Pepin, a foreign prince? Was it within the power of Pepin to release him from his lawful allegiance? Did not all the rights conferred to him by Pepin inure to the benefit of the empire? Can a rebel, by treaty or alliance with a foreign power, acquire any legitimate rights against his government or his lawful sovereign? It is necessary that these questions shall be decided in order to understand the nature of the donation of Pepin to the Pope, whether or no any temporal power was rightfully acquired by means of it, even if it conceded to have been the full extent claimed by the papal writers. It is believed that the law of nations has undergone no change in reference to these matters from the earliest ages of the Christian civilization. By its provisions, a rebel can acquire no rights in his own behalf as against his own government. For whatever he may do, whether by himself or by foreign aid, is considered only as resistance to lawful authority. A successful revolt is another and different matter. In that case, rights are obtained and held by the revolutionary force, and when they become accomplished facts, are, in the judgment of modern nations especially, entitled to the highest consideration. The American idea is that the best nations in the world have been the result of revolution, which is justified or not according to the degree of wrong and oppression it is designed to resist. But those who defend the temporal power of the popes derive no assistance from this doctrine. For one of the most prominent features in the papal teaching is the doctrine which denounces revolution and resistance to a legitimate civil authority. And it says, if the conduct... Now remember, we're talking about a time in 1864 where Pope Pius IX wrote his syllabus of error condemning what he referred to as revolutionary forces taking place both in Europe and in America, establishing their own republican forms of government, their own Protestant forms of government, if you will, and setting aside any temporal power of the Pope. Okay, this is when the Pope lost his temporal power. This began in 1798 during the French Revolution, when General Berthier removed the temporal crown of the Pope from his brow. And the Pope was, at best, just a bishop of bishops and had no power to rule. And that power being restored in 1798, or rather 1929 at the Lateran Accords, and ever since then the power of the Pope has been being reestablished in the world. We're talking about a time when the papacy first acquired this temporal kingly power, and it is based on fraud and treason by every standard, and will continue to tear down the foundation of the bogus temporal power of the papacy when we return from the break. It's nice to be back. I'd like to hear from my listeners today, too. If you would please send me an email, tom@seawaves.us, and we'll continue with the reading of our book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, when we return from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Okay, welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. Before I continue our reading, I want to finish the point I began to make before the break. In 1864, Pope Pius IX wrote his Syllabus of Error, condemning all of the nations of the world that had thrown off the authority of the papacy and established their own constitutions, essentially stripping the Pope of his temporal power, or attempting to. The Pope called these rebellions, revolutions, unlawful revolutions against the temporal power of the Pope. And here we see, while the papacy was making that claim, R.W. Thompson is revealing that the very foundation for the temporal power of the Pope is based on treason. So here we have the pot calling the kettle black. The papacy's temporal power is based on treason by every standard. It is believed, says the author, that the law of nations has undergone no change in reference to these matters from the earliest of the Christian civilization. By its provisions, a rebel can acquire no rights in his own behalf as against his own government. For whatever he may do, whether by himself or by foreign aid, is considered only as resistance to lawful authority. In other words, treason. A successful revolt is another and different matter. And we're talking about the successful revolt of the United States. A successful revolt is another and different matter. In that case, rights are obtained and held only by revolutionary force, and when they become accomplished facts, are, in the judgment of modern nations especially, entitled to the highest consideration. The American idea is that the best nations in the world have been the result of revolution, which is justified or not according to the degree of wrong and oppression it is designed to resist. But those who defend the temporal power of the popes derive no assistance from this doctrine. For one of the most prominent features in the papal teaching is the doctrine which denounces revolution and resistance to legitimate civil authority. If the conduct of Pope Stephen be measured and judged by these teachings, he undoubtedly brought himself not only in open hostility to the law of the empire, but to the law of nations and of God. Nor will the papacy be aided by what is called the doctrine of accomplished facts, for it has invariably taught that no rights are conferred by them when they grow out of a resistance to lawful authority, no matter how long they have been enjoyed, as the Pope shows in his encyclical of 1864, and as will abundantly appear hereafter. The conclusion is unavoidable that the popes acquired no rightful authority by the donation of Constantine, or rather the donation of Pepin. The territories donated were held by the Lombard king only by conquest, and had only been so held since the year 752, but 2 years. The superior title of the empire had not been abandoned, but still existed. If Pepin had taken from the emperor, then his title might have been defended, and in that event could have been disposed of them as he pleased. But he took them from the Lombards, not from the empire, which left the title of the empire a subsisting and valid claim, which could only be extinguished by force or treaty. Neither of these modes have been resorted to. Neither of these modes having been resorted to, they could be taken by the Pope only as a subject, not as an independent prince, having no right by the law of nations to acquire such title as Pepin attempted to confer upon him. He could only hold them in trust for his sovereign. Therefore, as he owed lawful allegiance to the empire, the title conferred upon him by Pepin inured to the empire. If he claimed or attempted to exercise power independently of the empire by virtue of it, he was by the law of nations guilty of usurpation or treason. And hence it follows that the temporal power of the popes derived from the donation of Pepin was not legitimately obtained, but was usurped by a flagrant violation of the law of the empire and the law of nations. The controversy about the worship of images, this period of iconoclasm, the iconoclasts, you can do your own research on that matter, but they simply used that as an excuse to say that the empire was divided between East and West over this veneration and worship of images and idols in the church, as an excuse to justify this treason. It's bogus, is what the author is telling us. It says the controversy about the worship of images was used as a pretext for its acquisition, but the real motive is exposed by the whole transaction. It was to build up a civil power in the West, with the Pope as the temporal prince, which should make the West more powerful than the East and restore to Rome her old pagan distinction as mistress of the world. And such is the truth of history when it is extracted from the mass of contradictions. Dr. Fred, the historian, was too sagacious not to have seen the force of the suggestions made here, and he has endeavored to counteract their influence. He is compelled to admit that at the time of the defeat of the Lombards by Pepin, the emperor, Constantine Compromise, continued to maintain his claim to the territory embraced by the donation of Pepin. He says, quote, "At this juncture, 2 ambassadors arrived from Constantinople to claim for the emperor the restitution of the cities and provinces which had been usurped by the Lombards," unquote. But then, in order to avoid the force of the argument that as these territories were held by the Lombards by usurpation, Their recapture inured to the nationality to which they legitimately belonged. He says also at another place, quote, "It is a principle laid down by civilians and founded on the law of nations that he who conquers a country in a just war, not undertaken for the former possessors, nor in union with them, is not bound to restore them what they would not or could not protect and secure," unquote. But if it be conceded that this is the statement of a just principle, it is broad enough to disprove the claim of temporal power based upon Pepin's donation. The reconquest of the territory held by the Lombards was, in the eyes of the law of nations, quote, "undertaken for the former possessors," unquote. In other words, the emperor. It says the emperor, it is true, did not solicit aid from Pepin, but the Pope, who was his subject, did. Pepin was bound to know, and did know, that the Pope was in revolt against his sovereign, the Caesar, the emperor. And consequently, there were two aspects in which he could have viewed his interference. Either that he was acting in behalf of the emperor at the solicitation of his subject, or was acting in behalf of a rebellious subject against his lawful sovereign. If the former, then by the law of nations, his donation inured to the empire. If the latter, he violated that law by becoming a party to an armed rebellion. But in point of fact, Pepin did not render assistance to the Pope as against the emperor, but moved his army against the Lombards and left the Pope after his donation to settle the question of his treason with the emperor. Therefore, his donation to the Pope was made to him as a subject, not as a prince. And consequently, as a subject, can take no title to territory which had once belonged to his sovereign after its recapture. The donation of Pepin inured to the empire and not to the Pope. If thereafter the Pope was unable to maintain his title to it, he could only have done it by successful revolution, which would bring it within the doctrine of accomplished facts now repudiated by the papacy. In any view of it, we cannot escape the fact that whatever temporal power the popes acquired by these proceedings was obtained by usurpation. Why did the French king make a donation of territory with the authority of temporal government to the Pope? This was about the middle of the 8th century, and for more than 700 years the Church had existed without a temporal ruler, without a king, and without a crown to place upon the brow of a king. There had been, up to that time, 6 ecumenical councils of the Church, and by none of them had it been declared as an essential part of the Christian faith that the Pope was infallible, or that his temporal power was necessary to the successful government of the Church, or to the successful propagation of the truths of the gospel. Why, therefore, this gift of a temporal crown? Manifestly, it was the reward which Pepin paid to the Pope for enabling him to maintain his treasonable resistance to the King of the Franks, by means of which he hoped to destroy a rival political power in the East and transfer the scepter of universal dominion to the West. It was the legitimate fruit of the alliance between the king and the Pope, by which the former gave political power in exchange for the ecclesiastical protection of the latter. The king made himself a party to the treason of the Pope, and the Pope made himself a party to the treason of the king. They were joint conspirators against lawful authority, one against his lawful king, the other against his lawful emperor, both against their national allegiance. Each had a worldly object alone, the acquisition of princely power. and therefore they both stand condemned by every just principle of international law, as they would do were their conduct now to be adjudged by the unbiased judgment of all the leading nations. During the late rebellion in this country, 10 of our states held possession of their territory by military force for several years, more than twice as long as the Lombards held Ravenna. They excluded the territory of the national government, defied its power, and erected a government of their own. Napoleon III, the favorite son of the Roman Catholic Church, had marched his armies from Mexico into the States, taken possession of them, and turned them over to the temporal government of Pope Pius IX, whose throne he was then holding up. Then the Pope would have had precisely the same temporal power over all these 10 states as Pope Stephen III acquired by the gift of the King of France. So this author is tactfully giving us an example of a rebellion in this country, the Civil War, when the South separated, renounced the authority of the North or the federal government of the United States and created its own government. And at that very time, Napoleon III, a favorite son of the Roman Catholic Church, occupied Mexico. And had Napoleon III, and I believe this is exactly what the papacy was trying to do at this time, trying to get Napoleon III and his armies from Mexico to march into the South and take possession of the South and award those states to the temporal power of Pope Pius IX. That's exactly what the papacy and Pepin did against the lawful authority of the emperor. It was unlawful, based on treason. And they tried to do this again during the Civil War. Let me read it again. It said, during the late rebellion in this country, 10 of our states held possession of all their territory by military force for several years, more than twice as long as the Lombards held Ravenna. They excluded the authority of the national government, defied its power, and erected a government of their own. Suppose Napoleon III, the favorite son of the Roman Catholic Church, had marched his army from Mexico into these states, taken possession of them, and turned them over to the temporal government of Pope Pius IX, whose throne he was then holding up. Then the Pope would have had precisely the same temporal power over all these 10 states as Pope Stephen III acquired by the gift of the King of France. In other words, the South would have become part of the Papal States. That's exactly what was attempted during the Civil War. It says the statement of such a proposition sufficiently refutes it, and yet there are those who habitually exhaust argument and eloquence in supporting the validity of a title thus acquired. Toleration does not require that these things shall be passed over in silence, nor is its spirit violated by the arraignment at the bar of public opinion. But there is a view of the question of temporal power designedly passed over until now, which is of sufficient importance to be considered. Suppose it be conceded that the Pope did acquire temporal power by the donation of Pepin. What then was its extent? We have already seen what all readers of history know to be true, that this donation only included the Italian territory held by the Lombards and taken by Pepin from Astolphus, the Lombard king. This was Ravenna, Bologna, Ferrara, and the Pentapolis, but not Rome. Get this. The Papal States legitimately do not include Rome because Rome was not possessed by the Lombards. Pepin didn't liberate Rome. He liberated these areas, but not Rome, and donated to the Pope those areas, but not Rome. So according to this argument, the papacy doesn't even have legitimate authority in Rome. This is hilarious. It says, again, we have already seen what all readers of history know to be true, that this donation of Pepin, only included the Italian territory held by the Lombards and taken by Pepin from Astolphus, the Lombard king. This was Ravenna, Bologna, Ferrara, and Pentapolis, but not Rome. The Lombards did not hold possession of Rome. Pepin did not have any authority over Rome, for he had no conquest of it, nor did he pretend to donate it, or any temporal authority over it to the Pope. If he had the authority and did confer temporal power over the territory that he took from Astolphus, the Lombard king, then he made the Pope prince over that territory alone and not over Rome. In Rome, he remained a subject to the emperor and could derive no right there from the donation of Pepin. The Pope cannot claim rightful authority in Rome, at least not by the donation of Pepin. That is hilarious. It says, whatever temporal power, therefore, the Pope acquired in Rome must rest upon some other foundation than the donation of Pepin. As the papists pretend to assign no other, it is necessarily the result of usurpation, treason. It has been remarked that the motives of both Pepin and the Pope were worldly, that they had reference alone to temporal dominion. This is a legitimate inference from all the facts. The faith or creed of the Church, as it had come down from the Council of Nice, was in no way involved in any of the pending matters of controversy, except as it was connected with the disagreement about the worship of images. There were no prevailing heresies calculated to disturb the harmony of the Church. The heresy of Macedonius, which denied the Godhead of the Holy Ghost, had been disposed of by the First Council of Constantinople in 381. That of Nestorius, which affirmed that there were two distinct persons in Jesus Christ, by the Council of Ephesus in 431. That of Eutyches, which denied the two distinct natures, divine and human, in Jesus Christ, was dispatched by the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And the Monothelite heresy, which asserted Jesus Christ to have no human will separate from divine will, by the Third Council of Constantinople in 682. Harmony, therefore, pervaded the Church in all its religious departments. Its faith was unagitated, its creed unassailed. But the Pope, looking out from the midst of his internal peace and concord upon the troubled political elements in France, had his own ambition excited and did not stop long to consider the means of gratifying it. The step taken by him was as fatal to true piety as it has in the end, after centuries of agitation, proved to be to the papal power he so ambitiously acquired. By it, he pulled down the Church from her high mission of saving souls, dragged her sacred robes in the muddy pool of earthly politics, and put her upon a career of corruption which has caused her own children to afflict her with mortal stabs. That's right, even Catholics can see the worldliness of the papacy and its worldly objectives as being contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is Roman Catholics who are the most effective critics of the Roman Catholic Church for her worldly stand. The author continues, he says, he declared to Pepin that it was the will of God that he should take the crown from the head of Childeric and put it upon his own head. Pepin needed no other persuasion than this to make him a devotee of a religion so favorable to his ambition. It was the very faith which of all others suited him best. He was easily persuaded to aid a pope who taught a doctrine so palatable to him, and to make it the religion of France, because it confined all subsequent kings to his own line. He staked all his fortunes upon the hazard, and he won the prize, while the venerable church, which was thus turned away from her peaceful paths and made to enter upon an ignoble mission, received a cruel and paralyzing blow. Centuries have passed since then, during which she has experienced the most varied fortunes, but she is yet reeling under that blow. That's right, the papacy still is reeling, is mortally damaged by its political endeavors around the world. Now, we have but to look at the manner in which the popes employed their spiritual authority in order to promote temporal and secular ends to see how the church was made to violate the injunctions of its founder, Jesus Christ, the example of the apostles, and the peaceful teachings of the early Christians. The retrospect reflects no credit upon those who became the active agents in these measures, but is made necessary by the enormous pretensions now set up in behalf of the papacy. And it'll serve to show also how necessary it is for the best interest of mankind that the nation shall not again suffer the church and the state to be united. R.W. Thompson is showing us exactly why every Christian, every knowledgeable Christian, should raise a hue and cry against any union of church and state, because that is the model under which Rome is the most successful. Any attempt to unite church and state is a papal prerogative, and it should be resisted at all cost. And what are we seeing in this country today? Candidates for president being selected by papal organizations, the Council on Foreign Relations, a union of church and state, the union of the United States with the Roman Catholic Church, and thus our downfall. We'll continue on the program tomorrow. Thanks for listening. It's the Inquisition Update on First Amendment.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.